One of the most inspiring missionary stories that I've experienced in my life occurred in the Boston area. In the early 1990s, we had a very strong ward called the Cambridge Ward. It was filled with returned missionaries at graduate student programs at Harvard and MIT, and boy, they were capable people. And they had all of the important responsibilities in the ward were given with people like that. But within the territory of the Cambridge Ward were a lot of neighborhoods that were blue-collar neighborhoods. And it was easy for the missionaries to baptize people in those communities, but when they would come to church, they just didn't fit. And so they'd drop out, or transportation was just difficult to get from where they were to the Cambridge Ward, and so they dropped out. And so in the early 1990s, the Cambridge Ward had about 180 active members, most of whom were longtime members, and about 300 inactive members who lived in Malden and Everett and Revere and so on. So the bishop of the Cambridge Ward decided to create a twig in Malden. And they called it a twig, not a branch, because it wasn't big enough yet. But the hope was that if we brought the church closer to where they were, that more of them could become active and stay in the church. There was a sister there, Sister May, who had a large living room, and she offered to have the meetings held in that living room. And she loved the church, but it was so hard to get there that she hadn't come to church for years and years. And on the first Sunday that they had sacrament meeting, 12 people came to that meeting. And the next Sunday, they asked our stake president, couldn't we just rent a place for this to be? Because it was quite inconvenient for Sister May. And he said, well, when you get 20 people coming to church, then we'll rent a facility. And so at the end of that meeting on the second week, those 12 members stayed around and with the missionaries asked the question, who else do we know who could have come here today who didn't come? And they'd list those that they knew, and then they took assignments to either visit them or phone them that day with the message, did you know that we have a church right here in our community? And there are just 12 of us coming, and we really need your help. Is there any way you could come next week? Can we do anything to help you so you could come? And then the next Sunday, they set up 20 chairs. And at the end of the meeting, they asked the same question, who could have been here today who didn't come? They took assignments, went to visit them, and so on. And within about 2 months, they filled the 20 seats. And so they were able to rent a hall to hold their meetings. But it turned out to be a real pain because they had to bring in all of the hymnals and the sacrament meeting material and the keyboard and then shut it all down at the end. And so they said to the stake president, can't we just rent this for the whole week so we can leave our stuff here? And he said, well, when you start to get 40 people, then we'll rent it for the whole week. So the next week, they set up 40 chairs. And they kept meeting after church, asking this question, now who else could have been here who didn't come? And some of the names that come to mind were occasionally active people, less active people, investigators of the missionaries. And they all would take an assignment, contact these people. And within about a year, they had filled the 40 seats. And then they asked this stake president, geez, do you think we could ever have a chapel here in Malden? And he said, well, you got to have about 80 people coming in order to qualify for a church. And so the next week they set up 60 chairs. Kept having that question. And within another year or two, they had filled those up. And then they set up 80 chairs and kept having that question. And as they were approaching 80, some of them said, you know, we don't want a phase 1. We really need a phase 2. And so they asked the stake president, what do we need for a phase 2 chapel? And he said, well, you really need 120. And so they set up 100 chairs and then 120 chairs. And within about 6 years after they had the first twig meeting, they had 120 people attending church. And they were able to build a beautiful building in Revere. And it's beautiful because it's just a monument to the practice of who couldn't be here today. And I was reading in Matthew chapter 18, where the parable of the good shepherd was recorded. And I noticed that this is exactly what the Lord said a good shepherd should do, is don't look at the 99 who came into the fold. Go after the ones who didn't come in. And the language there is the Lord said, what think ye? And I wondered, what does that figure of speech mean? And in my language, I think what the Lord was saying is, what in the world were you thinking about when you counted the number of people who comes to church, to sacrament meeting? Because the Lord wants to know who didn't come.